Hello everyone, and welcome to this ECIPE webinar about the Ukrainian war and the remaking of the economic and security order. We are just letting people in, but we only have 1 hour for this event. So we're going to get going right away while people log on to different platforms where they're going to watch this event. My name is Fredrik Eriksson, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by a panel of great experts who will help all of us, I hope, to decipher current geopolitical developments and what new security order we need to prepare for. I will present the speakers in a minute, but just want to set up this event a little bit first. Russia's war against Ukraine has already prompted geopolitical and geoeconomic reactions. The EU, the US, and a group of allies have imposed very strong economic sanctions against Russia, sanctions that will lead to a fundamental economic break and very few economic contacts with Russia. Yesterday, the EU released a new strategy to wean Europe off its dependence on Russian gas. The US has already decided to embargo Russian oil and gas. European countries are also speeding up the expansion of their military capacity, and there are fundamental changes in the making to how the EU is going to work in the future, perhaps even with a post of defense spending in its budget. But there are open questions about how far Europe is prepared to go, and also about the extent to which transatlantic partners are willing to let past frictions in trade, technology, and economic matters to be put aside in order to prepare the way for much deeper economic integration. And on military issues, how far are the EU and the US willing to go in the future cooperation? For its part, Russia will need new economic partners, and the question is where Russia will seek them. The underlying assumption in much of the commentary is that China will be happy to see Russia moving further into its fold because Beijing could then access cheap energy and get help in its own quest to advance its geopolitical goals. But is that really Beijing's intention? And is it prepared to prop up Moscow to the extent that will be necessary given the severity of the sanctions and the scale of its current economic fall? In other words, how likely is China to help Russia, and how will it perceive the risk that too much help to Russia will cause reactions in Washington, D.C., Brussels, and other capitals? To discuss all this, I am pleased to be joined by a fantastic panel. We have Elizabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on Europe and the Nordic-Baltic regions and hybrid threats. Previously with the Royal United Services Institute, she is most recently the author of The Defender's Dilemma, a book I strongly recommend. Patrick Chovanec is adjunct professor at School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, a former professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He worked for the US congressional leadership in the 1990s and then moved to academia and the private sector, where he still advises companies about their interactions with the world. And then we have Danuta Hübner, who is member of the European Parliament, a former professor of economics and a diplomat. She was the Undersecretary General at the United Nations, and for those of us in Brussels, known as, of course, a former European Commissioner. Dalibor Rohak is an author, economist, and expert on Europe and foreign policy, who has written several books, including In Defense of Globalism and Towards an Imperfect Union, also two books that I strongly recommend. Senior fellow at the AI, his research focuses on Eastern and Central Europe, and he now also runs a podcast, which I can strongly recommend, and that I will allow you, Dalibor, to plug when we start our conversation. Lastly, but not leastly, we have Niklas Svanström, who is the director of the Institute for Security and Development Policy, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, and a senior research fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. His research is focused on East Asia, China, Chinese foreign and security policy, and conflict and prevention management. So a warm welcome to all of you, and let's go right into some of the themes that we would like to discuss. So Europe has responded pretty firmly to Russia's war on Ukraine. And what we're going to see in the course of the next couple of weeks and months, perhaps even years, is of course that this work is going to continue. Some of what has been already decided is going to be implemented: the sanctions against Russia, assistance to Ukraine, military equipment aid, the management of refugees, and more. But the war isn't over and can definitely escalate in various ways, raising more questions about what Europe can do and what it can do more. There is a military element to this discussion, but there are also other elements. And I would like to start turning to you, Danuta. We have seen Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. They have just applied to be candidates to join the EU. And the question here is, how should we respond? There is talk about an oil and gas embargo, also from the EU, cutting Russia's ability to finance itself and the war. What do we need to do in Europe in order to make this idea realistic? Danuta, what do you say?
Well, thank you very much for just getting us together. And what is, I think, the worst in terms of thinking of what we should do and what we'll do in the future is this uncertainty. We don't know which way the escalation will take place. So we actually have been from the very beginning thinking in terms of a very sort of broad approach with regard to sanctions, even though they have been deployed gradually, because that's actually the only instrument we have as democracies in such situations are sanctions. And we couldn't use them. People were nervous, as I was saying, why don't we do this and that? And we knew that the moment will come to step up the sanctions. And that's, I think, very important. And also, we also have to take into account always when we reach out to sanctions, that there are also costs for those who are imposing sanctions, and we know the costs for the European economy, for the global economy of those sanctions as well. But I think the most important thing in the reaction of Europe was that we were not alone, and I can't imagine where we would have been if that was 2 years or 3 years ago. So I think the good thing was that we could work together along with US, with other allies in an extremely highly, I would say, coordinated and unified way, and also UN and the General Assembly voting, and that was, I think, all very, very helpful, that the West was united as never and managed to isolate Russia also as we have never managed before to isolate an enemy, a global enemy in the world. Well, what I think is important to raise is that the sanctions have been unprecedented, because we went through, starting with financial sector, through energy, through trade, through basically all the sectors, the transport, the very broad individual, unprecedentedly broad individual sanctions, and also media, and then reactions of private sector. So basically whatever you touch, you could find the justification for imposing the sanctions. And now we are also thinking of increasing the efficiency of those sanctions. For example, some of them will be efficient only if we introduce embargo on oil and gas import from Russia, which both UK and US, you mentioned, they have made it. And Europe, the last 2-3 days, we were discussing, debating it, and there is a plan coming from the Commission to move much quicker than we initially planned, because we planned within our greening agenda to get more independent from the import of fossil fuels and from using the fossil fuels. So we are currently on this. And I'm surprised in this plan by the Commission presented yesterday to be debated also in the European Council in Versailles, I think tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, to see how much in such a short period we can indeed do. And there is also funding which is unused within the recovery and resilience. Very few countries used the loans which are available under this huge investment program. So there is a space for moving much faster with a lot of adjustments and investment that would, first of all, I think, eliminate a bigger part of the fossil fuels as quickly as possible. that would also allow us to increase in the short term energy efficiency, that would allow us also to reduce the gas, but then to diversify. And on this, I think for months actually, the Commission was working on identifying the sources for diversification of the imports of fossil fuels, or also the others, LNG, for example. And so we are also moving on this. We are also, we see openness to better use within the European Union the storage, for example, for gas, so which some member states have developed and have also the capacity for solidarity with others, because we are dramatically strongly depending on oil and on gas import from Russia. You have Bulgaria that imports 100% of their gas from Russia, and we have it. In Politico, there was a very good article showing that basically in 2020, with low prices of gas, we have been financing with our imports of gas and oil from Russia. We have been financing the whole military budget of Russia. So we are daily importing gas from them. We are financing it's just, you can see how many tanks or how many planes we are financing. So this is definitely the biggest challenge for Europe, and we must do it as quickly as possible. And we are really with big steps aiming in this direction. So that's a very important thing. And then you mentioned another thing, which is the application, let's call it this way, this hope of Ukraine for a quick accession to the fast lane for the accession to the European Union. And you might know that we have been in developing the close ties with Ukraine as European Union basically since 1994, when we had the first agreement on partnership and cooperation with them, and then through neighborhood policy, through Eastern Partnership policy, and then through free trade agreement, and now it's an associated country with association agreement, a very deep and comprehensive trade element in this. You might remember that the fact that the previous president Yanukovych did not sign the association agreement, free trade agreement, back in 2014 was led to Maidan revolution, and then the Ukraine hope and ambition to become a member have been in many, I think, agreements that we had with them. It was always popping up as an issue. And now we cannot say no, I think. What we have to, because they need hope, and we should give this hope. But we should be very clear that they are part of the family. We want to have them, but it must take some time, because it's not only political decision like sometimes you take to do something. This requires still a lot of preparation on both sides, but mostly on the Ukraine side. So what we are committed to is to have Ukraine in European Union, in the single market, in Schengen one day, in all the in Euro. Every element of integration is open, but it requires a lot of preparation, a lot of work. It took us in Poland exactly 10 years from applying to becoming a member. Here you have also strong commitment that we will be all helping Ukraine to prepare. But you cannot, it's not even in the interest of Ukraine to become a member of weak Europe. So they have to come to strengthen the European Union. And that's why this taking seriously the legal adjustment, the criteria that the treaty is very clear about. But it's not a formal approach. It's just saying that we have to do everything to have Ukraine as a strengthening element, because we will have a bigger space, a democratic space, but it cannot be just overnight on the basis of a political decision. But I'm absolutely sure that Ukrainians understand this approach, because that's also to make Europe stronger in the interest of Ukraine. And I guess that we can do it together in a way that would be very beneficial for both sides. But it's just still a lengthy process to get through.
Indeed, it is. We're going to come back to that in a moment, but just take the same question to you, Dalibor. So we have a development over the last 2 weeks when I think a lot of people are surprised by the speed and the scale of the European actions. What can Europe do more? Of course, in partnership with United States and others, but both in terms of helping not just Ukraine, but other areas and other countries that, of course, are at risk of seeing similar type of wrath from Moscow being washed over them. So what would you see? Do you think is it an admission of EU candidacies from these countries? Is that something you would like to see from the EU?
Well, first of all, thank you, Frederick, for having me on this panel. I want to get to the narrow, specific question of enlargement and how we should think about enlargements going forward in a minute. But let me just offer first, a few observations to frame the conversation up. I have to say I'm somewhat nervous by a tone of self-congratulation and complacency that sometimes permeates the debate, both in Washington and also in Europe, about the EU's and the West's broader response to Putin's aggression, about the military quagmire that this Russian campaign has become. It is certainly true, and it is heartening to see that Russian military is not, in quite a strong shape as many people assumed. It is also heartening to see this degree of unity and decisiveness with which the West has responded. But we should also be able to sort of step back and see that, by and large, whether we like it or not, Putin is having his way in Ukraine. He might not be able to defeat it militarily and occupy it, installing some Russian satrap in Kiev. But he, if he can't do that, he still has the second best option of just reducing the country to rubble. And I think we are witnessing that in real time in places like Mariupol, Kharkiv, and elsewhere. And also, let's be honest about the nature of the response coming from the West. I mean, I'm certainly happy that the West got its act together in response to the Russian invasion, but we should not be kidding ourselves about this being a sign of policy success. I mean, as my colleague and Elizabeth's colleague at AEI, Chris Miller, who also teaches at Tufts, points out, the overwhelming nature of these sanctions are indeed a sign of a policy failure, of a previous failure to deter Putin by communicating clearly how far we were willing and able to go. And maybe there was no way of dissuading the Russian regime from embarking on this adventure. But the fact that we ourselves are surprised by how far we are willing to go in response to the Russian aggression is not a sign of success. I mean, it would have been a success if we had been clear and if we had communicated this clearly to the Russians to begin with and were credible, and if the Russians had stopped short of invading Ukraine. The fact that we are in the situation we are in is not a great thing. And also, like these displays of solidarity with Ukraine and the spontaneous outbursts of support for Ukraine that we've seen over the past 2 weeks, again, are very heartening, but that's the easy part. The hard part will be to sustain policies over the coming years that will cut off Russian oil and gas sector of Western revenue, that will over time change the incentives facing Russian elites and the regime. It seems very hard for sanctions in general to change behavior of autocratic regimes. But we have a duty to ourselves to insulate ourselves going forward from Russian influence and Russian dirty money and so on and so forth. And I think we are only at the beginning of a very, very difficult path. Now to the question of neighborhood policy, just one brief remark. I think people in the West have sort of overlearned the lesson of what is sometimes seen as a, like if you read the Ivan Krastev, Steve Holmes book about liberalism having supposedly failed in Eastern Europe. I think we have sort of overlearned that lesson. We look at sort of Hungary and Poland and democratic backsliding, and President Macron says that look how difficult it is to make decisions at EU27, and before this Ukraine episode started, there was a sense that maybe we should abandon this what is really the EU's only superpower to sort of transform its neighborhood into a copy of itself in a way. And I think that's a mistake. And I think one silver lining of the situation is that we will have to think about how to use this superpower more effectively and in a more flexible way. I think the old template for enlargement, in which you have long, protracted negotiations and all the dots are, all the T's are crossed and so forth, is just not sustainable in the light of the present moment. I'm old enough to remember in the 1990s this proposal floated by Wolfgang Schäuble and Karl Lammers, which sometimes was seen as motivated by a degree of Orientalism towards Central and Eastern Europe, which called for a more flexible approach to enlargement, in which you would get the benefits of partial membership in some areas. You could sort of fast track those without really counting on candidate countries embracing the whole acquis communautaire and just doing all the homework before enjoying the benefits of membership. But I think we need something like that with regard to Georgia and Ukraine and other countries in Moldova, so that we are able to pull them much closer to the EU and to the Western world, and insulate them from Russian interference and Russian aggression going forward. And I just don't think the sort of traditional approach that was used in the case of the Visegrad countries and Romania, Bulgaria would be of much help in these kinds of tense situations. So I'll stop here and I'll look forward to the conversation.
Oh, indeed. Thanks very much, Dalibor. Elizabeth, what do you say? Is Europe and America now rising to the occasion of dealing with sort of the new type of geopolitical situation that perhaps we've been confronted with for a longer period of time? Or are we still a bit naive in our general perception about what risks and threats that are going to face us going forward?
Well, thank you, Frederick, and it's a pleasure to join you and to join you again. I wanted to join you last week, and by now I get to do it. So Dalibor mentioned something that I think is very true, which is the self-congratulatory euphoria that is spreading as we speak, and has been spreading for the past couple of weeks, where people are writing long congratulatory notes to about the European Union and NATO and the Western Alliance generally, saying how fantastic it is that they managed to act collectively and decisively. And that is fantastic, but let's see how long this lasts. Let's see if it's a true change, or if this is something that was absolutely that was a result of there being no other choice, because this was such a blatant case where there needed to be collective action and there needed to be decisive action. So what if the threat next time is less obvious, and what if it's less clear that it's a violation of another country's sovereignty? What if it concerns a smaller territory, as indeed was the case when Russia originally invaded Ukraine 8 years ago? Then we weren't so sure, and we didn't really do a whole lot. We came up with a half measure, or with some half measures. So it's easy to sort of say, oh, this is a sea change. Well, it is a sea change, but will we always be this united? Will the euphoria wear off? And also, will it be there when the case is less clear cut? And we have to remember, this is not just about governments; it's about governments and companies. Governments acting together, governments acting individually. And by the way, Poland deserves enormous credit for rising to the challenge in all kinds of ways, from military to humanitarian. Who would have thought Poland, which was the sort of whipping boy of Europe just a few months ago, is now the key country addressing this enormous crisis. But what about next time? What about acts of aggression not committed by Russia? What if it's China? What if it's something less than China attempting to take all of Taiwan? What will we do then? And what will companies do? So it's I think so easy to just say, well, the world has changed and now we're united and now we know what to do next time. Next time will be much less clear cut, and that's what I worry about, and especially with regards to companies. It's only thanks to the cooperation of companies. Those under sanctions obviously have to cooperate, but other companies are pulling out of Russia too, just to do their part. Well, what if it's not that clear cut next time? What if it's not, the villain is not that obvious next time? Will they do their part that time as well? And also, what about the wider public? At the moment, Ukraine has, I think, the undivided support of the global public, apart from a few malcontents who insist on supporting Russia. But what about next time? What if it's not that clear cut? Will governments dare to take decisive action if they think, well, this is not really something that our voters care about? So I'll leave you with that, Frederick. I'm sorry, I'm sounding a bit pessimistic, but I think if we call this a sea change, it's a premature victory.
Yes, no, indeed. I think that's a very good point, Elizabeth. You mentioned China, and let's go to you, Patrick. What's the perception in Beijing? Are they surprised by Western actions, that they will actually go this far with its economic and financial sanctions? And to the general point, I mean, there is this assumption, which I said initially, that Beijing will find it very convenient that Moscow now is going to fold into China's broader hemisphere, and that it's willing to prop up whatever economic fallout that's going to come because of this war. Do you think is that a good understanding of how Beijing thinks about these issues now?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here. One thing I need to clarify first off is that I'm a former adjunct professor at Columbia ECIPE now. COVID's changed many priorities and many commitments, and so that's a recent change. I'm still at Silvercrest Asset Management, and we do watch these things very carefully. It won't change anything that I have to say. But China has been growing closer to Russia over the past several years under Xi, and that was sort of punctuated by the meeting that they had just before the Winter Olympics, and and essentially in anticipation of this invasion, in which we don't really know what the two of them said, but it was a moment of kind of them standing side by side with the imminence of the invasion as a real possibility. China has been moving closer to Russia for, I think, two fundamental reasons. The first predates Xi, and it has to do with China's resource dependency and its exposure on that front. China is the largest oil importer in the world. It gets most of it through sea lanes that are very exposed to U.S. naval interdiction in the case of a conflict. They've been conscious of this for many, many years, even before the most recent sort of tensions between China and the United States. And they have prioritized alternate ways, safer ways of getting access to resources. The clearest example of that would be pipelines from Russia. That's taken many decades, but it's developed, and I think it hasn't removed that vulnerability as Beijing's oil consumption has grown apace, but it has mitigated it somewhat, and that's very important to Beijing. It's also important to Russia because it's another customer for their main economic industry. The second thing is that they are very much aligned on how they see color revolutions, and they're concerned about that. Russia and China both see it as a scheme by the West in multiple countries to target regimes much like theirs. They see themselves on that list. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this brings them at least in sync and closer together. That does not mean that the relationship between China and Russia is not without its shadows or problems, potential issues. Russia's Far East is an area of sparse population that is resource rich, that lies right next to China's mainland, which is a huge population and is relatively resource poor. No one can ever fully forget that. I'm not saying that it's at the top of anyone's agenda right now. It's not on the top of either country's agenda, but no one can fully forget that. Back in 1969, China and Russia were on the verge of a what many considered a potential nuclear war in skirmishes, border skirmishes in that region. Tom Clancy wrote a book about, China coveting that part of the world and the resources that it has. Like I say, though, for both of them, this factor is kind of been put on the shelf for the time being. But it's interesting, though, how willing Russia has been to subordinate other interests to its relationship with China. For instance, China's Belt and Road initiative, it really is in many ways about China expanding its influence significantly in Central Asia, in areas which Russia would define as its near abroad, and an area that it should have predominant sway over. But Russia has been willing to sort of turn a blind eye to that and even cooperate with that because of these other priorities that it has. China, for its part, in this situation, Russia obviously would love for China to be its lifeline, to evade sanctions, to purchase resources, to prop up its economy. I think in China, there's a bit of ambivalence about that. On the one hand, just from a business point of view, there are a lot of people in China who would welcome the chance to capitalize on that. But it raises other issues and potential conflicts with other economic relationships that are very important to China. China's the second largest economy in the world. Russia is a relatively small part of its trade. It has much more profound economic relationships with Europe and with the United States, with Japan, other countries that are on the other side of this equation. And what it doesn't want to, I think, it doesn't care. China doesn't care one whit about Ukraine. It's simply outside of its realm of what it sees as its core interests, its relevant interests, much less its core interests. What they do care about is running afoul of anybody, either Russia, because it doesn't want to stand up to Russia and oppose what Russia is doing. It doesn't really have any interest in doing that, but it also doesn't, I think, want to be seen as the main enabler of Russia, or flouting sanctions in such a way that puts its own financial and economic and trade priorities at risk. And that's why I think we do see, I think back in 2008, the crisis when Hank Paulson tells the story that the Russians approached China at the very worst part of the crisis and said, hey, let's sell off US assets. Let's make this whole thing worse. And the Chinese went to Hank Paulson and said, we were approached by this. We're not going to do this. Now, a lot has changed since 2008. A lot of perceptions, more tensions, maybe priorities have shifted, sentiments certainly shift. But the fundamental trade-offs driving China's decision there, I don't think have changed so much. And so China, I think this accounts for why you do see China perhaps being a bit ambivalent and a bit vague about how it views this conflict and how it views the sanctions, and whether it's going to cooperate with the sanctions or whether it's going to facilitate Russia in any way. Now, the other question that's raised by this conflict certainly in the United States, people have talked about this, is what is the implications for China's perception of Taiwan and the possibility of some kind of hostile action by China towards Taiwan. I think that the simplistic view that sometimes gets touted out there that, okay, China's watching what's happening in Ukraine because if Russia's successful in Ukraine, well, then it's going to trigger them to go ahead and do the same thing in Taiwan. That is way overly simplistic. China has its own, the situation has its own dynamics. China has its own priorities and its own timeline when it comes to its own strategy. That said, I do think that China has been taken by surprise, as many of us have, by the unified Western response. I think that they imagine that a response to an invasion of Taiwan would be perhaps involve the United States militarily, perhaps they could deter that. But on the economic and global financial front, it would be more akin to the world's response to Crimea in 2014, that there'd be some sanctions, it'd be a little bit of pain, but people would eventually, it wouldn't take center stage. You wouldn't see what you now see, which is essentially, we don't want to call this diplomatically, but economic warfare that's taking place, which we haven't seen on a level since perhaps World War II, in terms of trying to freeze and cut off a country in response to some kind of action. I think that has really got China's attention. I think they're going to have to recalibrate, what the expected response might be in the West. And that's going to factor into their equations going forward. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a positive thing, that it may make them think twice and may challenge some of their assumptions about the West sort of just standing back. One more thing that I'll add, it's not sort of in my bailiwick, which you've given me, but I've noticed it, and I don't know whether anyone will bring it up, is other players in this equation are Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have been not only sort of signaling friendly intent towards Russia. Obviously, they're fellow oil producers. They've worked together in that respect. But also, just in the past day, the refusal to take a phone call from President Biden. It signals some unhappiness and some disaffection, and obviously these are major players in the world, certainly in the world of energy, and certainly loom large in the U.S. scheme of global geopolitical strategy. So, this development, I think, is interesting. And of course, it's not unrelated to China because China is sort of replacing the United States as their main customer. And so that may lead to a certain level of alignment of perceptions and interests as well. So I'll just throw that out there. I'm not an expert in that area, but it's something that I've been watching with great interest as this unfolds.
Indeed. No, thanks very much, Patrick. Nicholas, over to you. So I noticed the other day that the foreign minister of China made a comment basically suggesting that it was watching with concern how the West was perhaps trying to create a form of a NATO solution for the Pacific. You've watched China for a long time. You have watched how China collaborates with other countries. You've one of the leading experts globally on China's relation to North Korea and what's going on in North Korea. And there we have one example about China's willingness to participate with what it considered to be a subordinate country or a junior partner in sort of the broader global firm that they have. Patrick just mentioned a couple of Middle Eastern countries with close connections to China. What do you think China's sort of, not necessarily intention to be here, but what do you think they are thinking about when it comes to partnership alliances? Do they see Russia as a country that they can bring together in a broader coalition which goes against American and European power? How do they reckon with the fact that Russia may be a bit fickle and a bit unpredictable, and they may start to do things that they most certainly not going to like? So how much trust do you think China must see in Moscow in order for them to be sort of more forthcoming and more direct in its opportunity to help Russia in this current moment?
Well, thank you, Fredrik. I mean, I think, as Patrick was saying as before here, I mean, I don't see China and Russia sort of being a long-term partner. I mean, China knows the limitations of Russia very clearly. And I think it's China has refused to use the A word, alliance. It's they've been very clear that this is a partnership, it's not an alliance. And they also realized that creating an alliance with Russia would not be as stable or as financially, especially, but also militarily, as powerful as sort of a Western alliance with NATO, etc. So if China would join up with Russia in sort of a non-democratic alliance system, that would trigger a very strong response from the Western world. So the Chinese are much more eager to trying to reduce international alliances. And then this, I think this has been a big concern in China now, where from their point of view, and I agree actually that I think the response here has been very good, very positive from the European Union and the United States, but I'm not convinced that we have a enormously strong alliance, and I don't really expect us to stand up to work future threats. And I'm definitely not convinced that we will stand up against China in Taiwan if that would trigger. But for the Chinese, it's to have that fragmentation is probably the best thing they can look at. And actually, to be very frank, I mean, the opportunities China now sees being sort of a mediator in the Ukrainian crisis and trying to be the positive force is actually the best solution China can see, in a way that they can maintain the relations with Russia and at the same time maintain the relations with Europe and United States. So they would try rather to bridge and to decrease the necessity of Western alliances. So I don't really see China as that sort of being that interested in deepening the relations with Russia too much. And but as long as, and I think that what triggers, I mean, apart from what was mentioned before with the resources and all this, the conflict with the United States and the great power rivalry between the United States and China is one of the big factors that pushed China towards Russia, and also its relatively poor relations with Europe. And if that would continue, there are very few alternatives for China. Russia is one of the few powerful partners it really can single out. So for me, it's a question of necessity and more than anything else. But I still remain sort of rather pessimistic of what Europe can do. And I think we see that already now, that Europe has, and United States has in some ways approached China to become a partner, and be trying to get them on our side to exert pressure on Ukraine. And I think that is a problem, because Europe and the United States and other democracies need to find alternatives long term. We need to decrease the dependency. I mean, the challenge, the policy failure that was mentioned, is how can we allow ourselves to be so dependent on Russia and China for that matter? And we need to think about alternatives long term. And we fail to do that. And unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic long term. Right now, we seem to do all the right things. But 6 months from now, I'm rather convinced that we will backtrack on a number of issues. And I think that that's where we need to be much more focused on. What can we do long term? But the alliance between Russia and China, I don't really see that in the cards, and on the positive side. I'll stop there.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much, Nicholas. We're going to take another round with a panel, and you're saying a lot of interesting things, but we need to keep it a little bit shorter during this round so we have time for all of you, because I have more questions to each and all of you. Elizabeth, I'll come to you in a minute related to what you just brought up in the chat, but I wanted to go first to Danuta. So you mentioned yourself, tomorrow we have European leaders meeting in Versailles to take stock of not just the war itself, but also Europe's future. And I think that was the intention of President Macron when he first invited European leaders to come to facilitate or help a discussion which, in his view, is going to lead towards much more collaboration at the EU level on foreign policy and defense policy. Now there is talk about a new type of financial package that could help to generate more and faster spending on defense. But one question I wanted to ask you, and perhaps also in light of the fact that there is an EU-China summit coming up pretty soon. I think it's April the 1st even. And obviously, the war in Ukraine is going to be top of the agenda there as well. But in light of these, there has been discussions in Europe for quite some time now about developing its own strategic autonomy. And there is a military part of it, but there's also been an economic part of it related to trade, technology, logistics, capacity to innovate. How do you see that agenda going forward right now, given both the vulnerabilities we've been exposed to during the past 2 weeks with the war in Ukraine, and also perhaps thinking a bit more long-term, how we in Europe can sort of invest politically in order to improve the importance of our alliances and perhaps even go as far as deepening our cooperation with our allies also in non-military matters in order to present much more of a stronger and united geo-economic front.
Frederick, you are just opening a seminar for today's discussion, but I have to react to what Elizabeth and Dalibor said, and I'm sorry, I just tried to be extremely short, but I think it's very important that, of course, for the last 2 decades, we all know that we have entered with Mr. Putin into kind of transactional relationship where we were hoping that if we take him into the global sort of governance system, if we make them part of WTO, then we are going to have them kind of respecting also European values, and we then ignored signals that were coming with Crimea and later on with further wars in Ukraine. But now I think we finally, and we did it jointly, I think understood that we have to throw out this playbook we used for 2 decades. And that's, I think, this kind of value of this situation right now that I think Europe has just opened the eyes. And also if you think of all the big European taboos, like what we heard from Chancellor Scholz probably a week ago, they are all gone, when we can see that just decades-old German foreign defense policy is just upended. And we have, I think that nobody would expect this, also the freezing of the Nord Stream. We know for years these were the proposals which were rejected by Germany. Also, if you look at Denmark, Sweden, and Finland now changing also their approach to security or to join EU defense schemes. So we are, I think, just as I said, throwing out this playbook, we are also bringing, I think, a completely new approach of Europe to this big power, which is Russia. But we also have to understand that what happened is just unprecedented in the sense that long ago we jointly established the Security Council of the UN, where we had just 5 guardians of the global peace and security. And all of a sudden, we see that one of those guardians actually is launching a war, and that also means that all this security order is basically gone. And when I was listening about China, I think China is preparing itself to be one of those mediators that might be important. Like Turkey is also doing the same thing. That they might be important as those that would bring the rest of the world to the table when we will be deciding on the post-war security order in the new global order. And I think on China in this context, I would like to say that China still, I think, has to take political decision whether they want to be seen as a supporter of Russia war, whether they want to be seen as a country, as a state, as a power that is undermining the Western sanctions. We know that there are relations, there are reserves of Russia in China, there are swap lines, there is a lot of also economic links, but we also have to remember that both currencies, Russian and Chinese, are not useful in international trade. They even priced the gas trade in euro. And actually, if you globally, around 2% of the global world global trade is denominated in renminbi. So I think I agree actually absolutely with what Niklas was saying about the sort of further development of China's role in this whole thing. And the second thing on the enlargement, because the enlargement policy, I know that what Poland and Hungary did is just going to be used forever as an example of what we did wrong in the enlargement policy, but it's still, enlargement policy has been the most effective policy that was expanding the democracy, expanding the territory, the space for and of democracy in Europe and in the neighborhood. And I think it is important to remember. But of course, we have had for the last decades those discussions about the variable geometry, about differentiated integration. We also have the option of European Economic Area, where we have Norway and the single market. So there is a lot of options also for the future too. And I'm sure that we will sit on it after the war and see how we can organize our relationship with it's not only Ukraine, it's also Moldova and Georgia, as you know, recently. So that's, I think, very, very important. And I think that on this open strategic autonomy, which is sometimes used, or at the beginning it was used also to accuse Europe of beginning like a period of protectionism, of forgetting about the major, about the openness, which was the major characteristic, I think, of European economic policies since the beginning. But I think that this open strategic autonomy, which of course is a kit of specific situations that have been developing over the last years or decade in the world, and the need to Europe has understood the need to become more assertive in its trade policies and its external policy, and we understood that we have to develop in trade mostly, but not only, to develop those instruments, defensive instruments, so to see that we are also our interests both within the Union and outside the Union, that our interests are protected. And of course, the COVID crisis related and all the supply chains issues, the interdependencies and now dependence on the gas and oil from fossil fuels, because there is also hard coal in Russia. This is also, I think, supporting like this approach of more assertive Europe, and Europe that is developing what can be developed to reduce those interdependencies or dependencies on the rest of the world. But I think we are all the discussions point clearly to the understanding that this shouldn't have anything, and it's not my optimism, which I'm trying to have, not to start crying about the war, but it's just, I think it's very clear in all our debates that we are not, nobody would just embark on protectionist measures. We have a lot of cooperation also on all this investment screening, investment subsidies, and all those defense instruments also with US administration now. So we are, I think, building together a kind of new approach, new economic model, but that is based on more sort of more independence in economic terms and better preparedness for the situations of crisis that might lead to situations like we see now with Russia. On the defense policy, I mean, a lot can be done, but we are even discussing now on the defense policy that we might need new bonds, new European bonds issued for the sake of the financing of defense policy, which was like 2 years ago just a total taboo in Europe. So Europe is, I think, looking at the current situation from this perspective of the need to look anew at European integration and to see how we can evolve. And this might also be related to the enlargement policy as well, not only to defense policy.
Thank you very much, Danuta. Elizabeth, over to you. You wanted to comment, I think it was Nikla's pessimism, right? That you either want to support or perhaps take to an even more pessimistic level.
Well, I'm always happy to contribute with more pessimism. So I think I want to build on something that Nikla said, which was the government action taken in various times of crisis. And it seems to me that it's easy, and Niklas, you didn't do that, but something you said reminded me of this tendency that we have as analysts have of always criticizing government action for being too timid, regardless of what the issue at hand is. And so, for example, too much timidity when it comes to weaning ourselves off of Russian energy. But which elected politician would willingly go to the public and say, this is the deal I propose to you. You pay more for your energy because I propose that we as a country wean ourselves off of Russian energy. Who would do that? We all think we would be the brave leader who would do it. No elected official would dare to do it. No elected official who wanted to be re-elected. And so I think it's just so easy for us as analysts and the general public to sit here and say, well, why didn't we wean ourselves off Russian gas, oil and gas long ago? But it's just a reality, I think, that the public has become used to very convenient lifestyle, low cost for most things, and easy access to power, electricity, fuel in all its forms. And so I guess this is a plea for us all to not overestimate the opportunities for our elected leaders to have made this change long ago. And now, obviously, we are at a point where it seems very wise and indeed urgent to wean ourselves of Russian fossil fuels. But how would we have done it previously? The electorate would have rebelled.
Indeed, very good points. Dalibor, there has been references in the European debate, and I'm sure in the American debate as well, as this being sort of a new post-1945 moment, which is going to unleash very strong transatlantic cooperation in the future, both on military, economic, and technological issues. What's your assessment of the situation? Is it likely that this moment in history is going to turn the transatlantic partners towards each other? Or do you think that there were already undercurrents moving over decades that will make it difficult for the US and the EU to collaborate closer, and that they're rather going to be stuck in sort of mindsets which have been strong in the past in Europe, for instance, that we want to cut our dependence on US technology and become much more sovereign in our economic performance?
I think it's very difficult to sort of to overestimate the importance of this moment. Obviously, it's very hard to predict the ramifications. Now it looks like an extraordinary moment of unity and coming together for transatlantic partners. And I certainly wouldn't want to diminish what's been done, but in a way, I think Peter Pomerantsev, our friend, put it sort of half jokingly on Twitter that this is a very good response to what Russia did in 2014. It is somewhat frustrating to to watch the sort of self-congratulation on both sides of the Atlantic to a response to an event which actually was quite foreseeable, and many people, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, in places like Poland, were warning that this was coming. Now to the question of whether this is going to strengthen the transatlantic relationship versus whether it's going to drive Europe and the United States apart, I think that is a function of political leadership and of the decisions that will be taken. I would like, if I had the power, I would ban the terms strategic autonomy and European sovereignty from being used. Obviously, strategic autonomy has this Gaullist flavor of being autonomous of the United States. Presumably, if anything, this crisis shows that NATO is extremely relevant, that America's security umbrella is important for Europe. But even more fundamentally, I think these terms create the sense that the EU is a state-like actor in a way, which it really isn't. And I'm not sure it should aspire at being one. Whenever it tries to project this sense of strategic autonomy, you end up with situations like High Representative Borrell's promise that we would give fighter jets to Ukraine. And it's not the case that the EU would have any fighter jets at its own disposal. And then you get this sort of omnishambles of transatlantic debates about who sends the jets and under what conditions and which airbase is going to be used. And it just turns out to be a complete embarrassment. That said, I think Europeans need to do more. I don't think there is any debate about the need to take European security more seriously, primarily at the national level. And we've seen indeed a sea change in places like Germany and elsewhere with defense spending. I hope the momentum is sustained going forward. I think we clearly need more coordination, including at the European level. And you have some of the structures already in place, like PESCO and these ad hoc coalitions, 3 Seas initiative. It will be very important to build more sort of north-south connectivity on NATO's eastern flank, both for defense military purposes, but also in terms of energy infrastructure. The EU funding can play a very useful role there. I'm not at all opposed to this idea of helping to countries to meet their defense spending targets through European resources, whatever form it takes in the end. And I think it's also important to nurture some sort of shared strategic culture at the European level. I think the past decade was marked by so many different crises and firefighting and these sort of ad hoc meetings of the Council, at which there was, I think, very little time and space for sort of calm, serious, forward-looking debates about what shared European interests are and where do we go from here. But I don't think the end result will be anything that resembles a sort of sovereign or autonomous European superstate. I think we live in a reality in which European countries are diverse, have very often very different understandings of the strategic environments and their interests, and the EU is indispensable as a platform for keeping it all together. And we should be sort of realistic about that role and try to help Europe make the best out of those institutions, not to sort of try to turn it into something that it is not.
All right, very good. Let's turn to China towards the end now. Patrick, if I were sitting in Beijing, looking at the sanctions packages attacking the central bank, going after the securities and the foreign exchange reserves, I think my reaction would be, oh my God, I think I need to start make preparations for a different type of economic warfare. And I would accelerate all the other strategies, economic strategies that I've had in order to reduce our exposure towards the United States and Europe and to become much more sovereign in our own way or in our own sort of economic policy, both on how we sort of organize a payment system to where we, who we cooperate with when it comes to storing our foreign exchange reserve, to how dependent we're going to be on foreign suppliers for critical technologies.
So all of these things have been discussed in reference to China in the United States in recent years. They've been proposed by various people, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes in policy discussions. So China has already been kind of exposed to the fact that people in the United States are thinking about these sorts of tools and thinking about how to respond to them. That said, I think the Chinese realize, as perhaps the Americans don't always seem to, that applying these to China would be of a whole different level of difficulty and challenge than applying them to Russia. Economically, right, the exposure to Russia and Russian retaliation really boils down to one sector: energy, maybe some other strategic minerals, but basically that's where it's felt. And if you can protect and insulate yourself, or if you're coming out of winter and maybe aren't as reliant going forward on natural gas as you might be going into winter, then you can do some of these things and not fear the consequences. With China, the supply chains are much broader, affect a much broader range of goods. I mean, even just the chemical industry, almost all our basic chemicals come from China. This is an issue that would immediately come to the fore. Financially, when you put a freeze on the ability to buy and sell, mostly sell U.S. treasuries that you hold, I think that that's fine as long as everyone recognizes that this is a really unusual circumstance and assumes that it will never happen to them. The moment that people around the world start saying, that could happen to me if I run afoul of US policy, that's the moment when US treasuries start becoming a risky asset to hold. And that has consequences for the US financial system much more broadly. I do think that the Chinese face, it's not as though the Chinese can simply say, well, you know what, we don't really want to hold dollars, so let's just get rid of them. It's not that simple. They have to make, it involves other kind of economic choices, the kind of choices structural choices that they've been unwilling to make, and to reduce their exposure in that way. And so it's not as though, oh, they've caught on and they're just going to do a couple things that are very easy to unlock themselves from exposure to the U.S. economy, any more than going and buying some oil from Russia really eliminates the fact that they still are dependent on sea lanes for all sorts of inputs. So are they thinking about this? Absolutely. Does it involve sort of any easy solutions for them? No, it does not. And it also poses immense challenges for the U.S. and for the West if we really think seriously about what the implications would be.
Indeed. Nicholas, you spoke in your previous comment about China-Russia. Let me ask you about China-EU. So, I mean, a way to, perhaps I'm going to generalize a little bit too much, but let's put it like this, that Europe perhaps hasn't been very strong and forceful in the way that it has developed a policy to deal with both geopolitical and economic challenges that are posed by the rise of China. I think the understanding in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe for quite some time has been that they don't want to follow a more confrontative American approach towards China. There were, of course, the situations in Hong Kong where there were reactions coming from Europe, which led to counter reactions, but still, these reactions were pretty mild. Do you think that this moment, the experiences we have from our dependency on Russia, how it can lead to pretty forceful geopolitical changes happening in a very short time in our own neighborhood, is that going to inform Europe's policies vis-a-vis China in the future? Will we become sort of more confrontative or more defensive in our approach?
Well, I think the answer is we probably should. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, for reasons that's been mentioned. I mean, this is right now we have the diesel in Sweden is €3 per liter, and it is extremely costly to take these measures. I think there is a realization in Europe that China is a challenge, and we need to decrease dependency on non-democratic states, but it's very difficult to do. And I think there's reluctance to take the cost. And I mean, I would argue we need to take the short-term costs now. That's going to be painful to reduce the long-term cost in the future. And actually, this is not, I mean, I think we should actually look at China. China has implemented a number of policies to reduce foreign dependency, strategic resources. They're trying, and of course, nobody can fully insulate themselves against international exposure. But China has actually been quite good at developing a strategy to create a bit more of an independence. And what I would like to see is really Europe to homeshore much more of its industries and technology, create a closer cooperation with the United States and other allies and partners. Does that mean we can fully reduce our dependency or our cooperation with China? Of course not. China is an extremely important actor, and so is probably Russia, even if it's only restricted to natural resources. But I think we definitely need to lift the issue. We notice what a small economy as Russia can do, what cannot a large economy as China do. And I think it would be healthy to consider this and reduce dependency on China. Am I optimistic? Not really. I think that there is a reluctance for politicians and the businesses to take the cost short term for long-term benefits. But I think we need to do. I think and as scholars, we need to point in that direction. We need to sort of point out the dangers. But, you know, any form of reduction is a positive reduction, but I'm not very optimistic.
All right. Thank you very much, Niklas, and thank you very much to all of you. We are running over a bit already, and we could go on for another hour easily. But at least in our part of the world, the time is getting a bit late. So I would like to thank all of you for great contributions. This was a very good conversation, I think. It was certainly enlightening and inspiring to myself. I am sure we have plenty of opportunities to get back to all of these issues that we've talked about today in the future, because they are not going away. So to Danuta, Elizabeth, Dalibor, Patrick, Niklas, thank you so much, and have a good evening, if not a good day.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.